Chapter 34, Section 4, The Federal Government Confronts Racism. On March 31, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. preached at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. In his sermon, King spoke frankly about racism. It is an unhappy truth that racism is a way of life for the vast majority of white Americans, spoken and unspoken, acknowledged and denied, subtle and sometimes not so subtle. Something positive must be done. Everyone must share in guilt as individuals and as institutions. The hour has come for everybody, for all institutions of the public sector and the private sector to work to get rid of racism. Martin Luther King Jr. remaining awake through a great revolution, 1968. The hour never came for King. Days later, he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, where he'd gone to support a sanitation workers' strike. Riots erupted in more than 100 cities, including Washington, D.C. As dawn broke on April 6, 1968, a thick pall of smoke hung over the nation's capital. In the wake of these tragedies, the federal government increased its efforts to end racism and discrimination in public life. Banning racial discrimination in housing. Before his death, King had shifted his focus from integration to economic equality. As part of this campaign, he took on the issue of racial discrimination in housing. In many U.S. cities, landlords in white neighborhoods refused to rent to blacks. African Americans also found it difficult to buy houses in many neighborhoods. Even when African Americans found a home to buy, they discovered that banks were reluctant to make loans to black borrowers. Under King's leadership, the black community joined with realtors and bankers to encourage open housing in Chicago. But very little had actually changed. Then, in 1968, only days after King's assassination, Congress finally took action. Drawing on King's efforts and on the national grief over his death, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1968. This law included a fair housing component that banned discrimination in housing sales and rentals. It also gave the federal government the authority to file lawsuits against those who violated the law. Desegregating public schools. In 1954, the Supreme Court had ruled in Brown v. the Board of Education that school segregation was unconstitutional. A year later, it had ordered schools to be desegregated with all deliberate speed. But a decade later, only 1.2% of black children in the South attended integrated schools. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 gave the federal government new powers to promote school desegregation. Government officials pushed school districts to integrate their schools by threatening to cut off federal funds if they did not. By 1968, the proportion of African American students in the South attending schools with whites had risen to 32%. By this time, however, the Supreme Court was losing patience with school districts that were slow to act. In a 1969 case known as Alexander v. Holmes County Board of Education, the court took another look at with all deliberate speed. The case involved a segregated Mississippi school district that was trying to delay integration. In the court's decision, Justice Hugo Black wrote, "There are many places still in this country where the schools are either white or Negro, and not just schools for all children as the Constitution requires. In my opinion, there is no reason why such a wholesale deprivation of constitutional rights should be tolerated another minute. I fear that this long denial of constitutional rights is due in large part to the phrase, 'with all deliberate speed.' I would do away with that phrase completely." Alexander v. Holmes County Board of Education, 1969. 3 years later, the Supreme Court took another look at school segregation in Swan v. Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education. This case raised the question of whether de facto segregation caused by housing patterns was constitutional. This was a situation in North Carolina's Charlotte-Mecklenburg School District, because most children in the district lived in predominantly white or black neighborhoods. They also attended all white or all black schools. In 1970, a federal judge ordered the district to use busing to integrate its schools. Under the judge's desegregation plan, some students, including very young ones, would be bused to schools outside their neighborhood to create more racially balanced schools. The school district appealed to the Supreme Court, arguing that the judge had gone too far. In a unanimous decision delivered in 1971, the court supported the judge's busing plan. "We find no basis for holding that the local school authorities may not be required to employ bus transportation as one tool of school desegregation," wrote Chief Justice Warren Burger. Desegregation plans cannot be limited to walk-in schools. Using busing to achieve racial balance in schools. The court's approval of busing to achieve racial balance in schools was controversial. Supporters argued that busing was useful for ending school segregation. They quoted studies showing that black children got higher test scores when attending integrated schools. However, many parents, both black and white, felt strongly that their children should attend schools close to home. They worried about the effects of long bus rides, especially on young children. They also feared for the safety of their children bused into unfamiliar neighborhoods. Nowhere was resistance to busing stronger than in the city of Boston, Massachusetts. In 1974, a judge ordered the busing of 17,000 Boston school children to desegregate the city's schools. Large numbers of white families opposed the judge's order. Resistance was especially strong in South Boston, a mostly white neighborhood. When school began at South Boston High School that fall, 90% of its white students boycotted classes. Black students leaving the school to board buses back to their neighborhoods were pelted with rocks. Later that fall, a white student was stabbed in a racial confrontation at the school. In response, an angry white mob trapped 135 black students in the school building for 4 hours. A force of 500 police officers was assigned to South Boston High, which had only 400 students, to keep order. Over the next 2 years, an estimated 20,000 white students left Boston public schools to avoid busing. Some went to private schools, others moved with their families to the suburbs. As a result, by 1976, blacks and Hispanics made up the majority of Boston's school population. Despite public resistance, the courts continued to enforce the Brown decision. By 1976, almost half of black students in the South attended schools with a majority of white students. In the Northeast, only 27.5% of black students attended integrated schools. Fighting racism in the workplace through affirmative action. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had outlawed discrimination in hiring based on race, religion, gender, or national origin. However, many argued that simply leveling the playing field in hiring was not enough. As President Lyndon Johnson observed in a speech to graduates of Howard University, "You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race and then say, 'You're free to compete with all the others,' and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. Thus, it is not enough just to open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates." Lyndon Johnson, Howard University, 1965. Johnson argued that more needed to be done to counteract past discrimination that had denied minorities equal opportunities. One way to do this was through a policy known as Affirmative Action. This policy called on employers to actively seek to increase the number of minorities in their workforce. Affirmative action was first introduced by President John F. Kennedy. In 1961, he introduced an executive order that called on contractors doing business with the federal government to take affirmative action to hire minorities. President Johnson expanded Kennedy's policy to include women. He also required contractors to have written affirmative action plans. "This is the next and more profound stage of the battle for civil rights," Johnson said. "We seek not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and as a result." President Richard Nixon took affirmative action a giant step further. In an executive order, he required government contractors to develop an acceptable affirmative action program that included goals and timetables. Equalizing opportunities through preferential treatment. Many Americans agree with the goals of affirmative action. However, the practices used to carry out this policy have been controversial. An affirmative action plan may set specific goals, such as numbers of minorities or women workers to be hired. It may include a timetable with dates for achieving those goals. It may also prescribe preferential treatment for some groups. This means giving preference to a minority or female job applicant because of that person's ethnicity or gender. To many people, preferential treatment looks like unfair discrimination against white males. During the 1960s, many colleges and universities adopted affirmative action plans to attract more minority students. Members of minority groups were often given preferential treatment over white students who were equally qualified or more qualified. Such treatment was necessary, admissions officers argued, to open opportunities for minorities and to create a diverse student body. In the late 1970s, a white male named Alan Bake challenged a preferential treatment in university admissions. Bake had twice applied for admission to the University of California, Davis Medical School. He was rejected both times. At the same time, minority candidates with lower grade point averages and test scores were admitted under a special admissions program. Bake concluded that he had been refused admission because he was white, and he sued the school for reverse discrimination. In 1977, Regents of the University of California versus Bake reached the Supreme Court. After hearing arguments on both sides, the court was left deeply divided. 4 justices were firmly against any use of race in university admissions. Another 4 felt just as strongly that race should be used. The remaining justice, Lewis Powell, thought race could be used as a criterion in choosing students, but opposed the system of preferential treatment used by the University of California. Writing for the majority, Powell cautioned, "Racial and ethnic classifications of any sort are inherently suspect and call for the most exacting judicial scrutiny." The court's ruling narrowly upheld affirmative action by declaring that race could be used as one of the criteria in admission decisions. However, it also said that racial quotas were unconstitutional. The race could not be used as the only criterion. Therefore, the court ordered the university to admit Bake to medical school. The ruling, however, did not end the debate over affirmative action and preferential treatment for women and minorities.